Hello friends, for today's video I'm going to be going through 3 new fantasy book releases. We have The Last Tale of the Flower Bride, Unseelie, and City of Nightmares. I'm going to go ahead and start with this one here. This is a very short adult fantasy story that is definitely leaning into gothic inspired, if not just gothic fantasy. The setup for the story is we follow this young man who has met this very interesting, unusual woman, and they very quickly have this sort of whirlwind romance, and she tells him, "I will marry you, but you are never to ask about my past." And it says on the back here, inside every story is a secret, inside every marriage is a lie. He is so infatuated and in love with her that he agrees to this, but when they return to her childhood home to deal with the passing of a loved one and what will come of this estate that she lived on, that is when some of her secrets sort of start to unravel, and the young man cannot resist trying to dig up her past. The house itself definitely feels almost like it's its own character, but I would say if you are a character-driven reader, if you're somebody who wants to feel this strong connection to the characters, if you want to see yourself in them, if you want to relate to their interactions or just be fascinated by this twisted, dark love story, I would not say that that's exactly what this is, in that the characters don't necessarily behave like your typical person. They don't really act like regular people. It's much more about how they fit into this aesthetic. You're not going to get this beautiful love story or this really passionate love story the way that I think the marketing might have led some people to believe. I think the marketing has sort of led it to seem as though you're going to get a dark love story and that their passion is going to be put to the test by whatever happened in her past. And that's surface level true, but it's not a romance. If you're looking for an interesting romance story, I don't think you're gonna really get that out of this. This is much more about the way in which our trauma, how it can manifest into something sinister, how it can become almost something physical, something that you have to confront and face. And I found one of the plot lines to be almost predictable. There was a couple things in there that I was surprised by, but it was a different plot line that really took me aback, and it sort of, once I got to the end, made me think about the rest of the story differently. But it very much reads like a fairy tale. You know how there are certain stories where somebody, or a Greek tragedy or things like that, where you talk about the way that people behave and you talk about the actions they take, and none of it seems like rational behavior. None of it seems like, oh yeah, that's exactly what I would do in that situation. It's just this interesting tale. I do think this is going to be very hit or miss for a lot of people. It's just kind of very specific and it feels very niche. It's also quite dark. There are some rather morbid topics. There are also some things that have occurred that have to do with family members being abusive to one another and predatory, which was very difficult to read, but it doesn't go into extreme graphic detail. It goes into an interesting territory, though, where it's playing off of a lot of these tragedies and these fairy tales that we have seen in the past. This is, in a way, kind of taking all these different stories that we've seen so many times before, and it's framing everything using these stories, and then it's kind of dissecting those and breaking those down. So it's actually a really interesting, I think, approach to a fairy tale or a gothic-inspired story because it is building off of that foundation of these previous fairy tales. But I think that in other Grimm stories, you will see these dark, horrific things mentioned, and it's just kind of a part of the story, whereas this one sort of takes those ugly things, and it's almost like, look at it, look what it does to people, look how it can twist things in a person's mind, how it can be so all-consuming. And so, for that reason, I really liked this, but I think a lot of people, it is not going to be their cup of tea. It's odd, it's strange, and it has that sense of, I don't quite know what's happening. I don't quite know if this is real. Is this real? This person's terrible. I don't really like this person. I can't really root for them. Wait, but did that person actually even do that? It's got a lot of those things, and I can absolutely see this not appealing to everyone, but I was quite moved by it, to be honest, and I think it's going to be one of those stories that I'm going to be very curious to see what other people think of it. Speaking of strange and different, next up we have City of Nightmares. This was really weird. This one is strange in a very different way, where The Last Tale of the Flower Bride has that gothic inspiration and it's very much rooted in fairy tales and its setting. City of Nightmares is just odd. It's just weird, but I had a really good time with it. I enjoyed its weirdness. It doesn't make a ton of sense. You kind of just have to roll with it. The setup is we follow this young woman named Ness, and Ness had something really disgusting and horrible happen to her when she was young. And that has to do with this strange phenomenon that has occurred in the world, which is that people's fears, their nightmares, can turn into something real. They can become their worst fear, and then whatever that fear is, if it is predatory in nature, if it is animalistic in nature, it can go on a killing rampage, which is what happened with Ness's sister. Ness's sister turned into a massive spider and ate their father, and then there are now patrol type of people that their jobs are specifically to root out nightmares and to track them down and to kill them. So that is what happened to her sister. So in one night, this disgusting, horrible thing occurred to Ness where she lost her father and her sister. Most of the time, people don't turn into nightmares because there is something that is now in the water that helps keep people from dreaming. And there's also certain medications that can help in such things. So most of the time, people are okay. But every now and then, people decide, oh, I'm going to try to test the waters. I'm going to test fate. I'm going to see what happens if I let myself dream, or they forget to take medication, or they haven't had any of the water to drink that day. And so nightmares still do exist. Ness is terrified of them. She is currently working for and living within this group that everybody in society kind of thinks is a little bit of a cult. This group is supposed to help people process the trauma of what happens after somebody they know becomes a nightmare. And Ness is living here. She is just trying to get away from nightmares, and anytime she has to go to basically a crime scene, if there's a chance of the nightmare coming back, she does not handle it well. She abandons all her training, and she usually just goes right back to hiding, because that's what she did when things happened with her sister and her father. So it's a weird setup, but it was also strangely funny. I definitely think the author had a lot of fun with this premise, because you can do so many things with this premise. For example, in their world, I thought this was kind of hilarious, even though it's dark. So a lot of people, when nightmares first started to become a thing and before they figured out a way to keep people from dreaming, a lot of people would turn into vampires. However, people's idea of what a vampire is has been changed depending on what media they're consuming, what books they've read, what movies they've watched. So some people, when they become a vampire, if you get them with a wooden stake, they'll die. Garlic and holy water works against them. But then other ones are more like Twilight ones, where they're sparkly and different things affect them. So then you have a whole unit within their patrols that are kind of specific to hunting vampires, and they have almost like subgenres, if you will, of like vampire hunting. So I thought that was really interesting. But then as vampires have come into existence, then people's actual fears of vampires are being realized, and then they fear whatever this new version of vampires are. And so that was kind of interesting as well. So it was kind of a, I guess you could say, a cool world building detail. On top of that, sometimes people turn into nightmares that don't harm other people, but it can permanently affect them. So some people, for example, if you're afraid of a lizard or something, you can become like a lizard person. And so there's just so much about it that I was like, wow, I've never read anything quite like this before. It made me laugh quite a bit too. Like, I know some of it sounds so morbid, and then I'm saying like, oh, but it was funny. But some of the background details that would occur in the book I found humorous. There's one that I texted Sean, my husband, when I was reading. I was like, this made me laugh. So the girl is talking to her boss, and there's a newspaper article or something. It's within the first few pages of the book, but there's some kind of article with a headline of the mayor being sentenced to prison. And so it says, mayor sentenced to 6 months in prison on corruption charges, says it will be a good networking opportunity. And just things like that made me chuckle. So I just found that it was not only bizarre in ways that I found really unique, but also I thought that it was very amusing at the same time. I did enjoy how different this was. I did enjoy the progression of the plot. I also really enjoyed the friendship between our main character and her best friend. I loved their relationship. So I had a blast with this book. However, I can absolutely see so many people being like, what am I even reading? This is too weird and not really liking it. So if you think it sounds interesting, if you think like, oh yeah, I'm down for a really weird time, then absolutely, I highly recommend this. But if you're like, I don't know, I'm a little on the fence, I guess I want more of like a streamlined plot, or I want something that feels a little more familiar, or maybe isn't so out there, then it might not be the book for you. Last for today, we have the book Unseelie. This is a story that follows a young girl who is twins with somebody who is human, and then she herself is part fae. And this has to do with the fact that she is a changeling. So the story is very much taking the concept of a changeling and also how people view this in regards to fae. And then that is what you get with this sister relationship. If you don't really know the changeling lore and things like that, the idea is that babies would be taken and then replaced with a fae child, and this fae child would be very kind of terrible to their human parents. And you will find in a lot of fae stories that are a little bit more grim or a little bit more on the horror leaning side, you will see a lot of them rooted in changeling stories. The idea with this book is that our main character, Unseelie, is somebody who she is the changeling, but the mother of the human child decided, I'm going to get my child back from the fae, and I'm going to raise this changeling child as well. However, being raised among humans and being a changeling, and it's known that she's a changeling, a lot of people have mistreated her and her family, and so these two twins decide they are going to leave, and they're going to try to find a way to do what they can to provide for their parents, and that way they don't have to live among these people that mistreat them. So they go off kind of on this adventure. They're trying to pull off a heist, but this heist goes wrong, and they are paired up with a couple of other people, and they are now on this mission to seek out what is basically a treasure. They don't know what the treasure is, but they know it's worth a lot. The other two have their own reasons why they're after this treasure, and you kind of learn more about them as the story goes on. And then our main characters, of course, want whatever money this treasure can bring so they can take care of their parents. Along the way, there are some people that are coming after them, that they themselves are looking for this treasure, but the way to find it is now within Unseelie. During this heist that has gone wrong, there's this sort of magical being that's now in her head that is providing a map. A huge factor of the story is the fact that Unseelie is somebody who is autistic. The author has a fantastic author's note at the beginning about how she is trying to write an autistic character not by just labeling them autistic, but by showing, because they don't have this term in their world, so she is showing through how Unseelie behaves, how she thinks, how she responds to things that are happening, how she reacts to things. She's trying to show through those things her being autistic. And the author herself is trying to make sure that she is writing a flawed character, a realistic character, while also staying true to her own experiences. And so I definitely found that how the character was reacting to things, it provided, I think, fantastic insight into how differently all of us process things, how different things that from one person to the next, maybe somebody doesn't see something as that big of a deal, but it can be so disruptive to someone else. So I really appreciated that factor of the story. I also think by having her sister be somebody who is so different from her, Unseelie's sister, that you see she loves her sister's like her rock. But when her sister kind of wants to eventually go off on her own path and she wants to live her own life, there's that sense of, why are you leaving me? Why are you abandoning me? Aren't we a unit? Aren't we together? You are part of my norm. And so there's just really interesting family dynamics that are dissected within this as well. I did like aspects of the plot, but I don't think that the plot itself of this story is the thing that stands out. I don't also think it's the most unique or the most original. And I don't know if that matters too much because I don't really feel like that was the focus. I think it was a little bit more of a character study, but there is that kind of fun, adventurous feel. And I am curious what's going to happen based off of something that transpires at the end of the book. And I did like the way that you see the characters interact with one another. I think that if you go into this, definitely read the author's note and just kind of keep in mind that we have seen so little representation like this in books, that this character is not going to behave in the same ways we've seen so many other characters behave. And I just think that I'm so happy that books like this exist and that we're getting more of this kind of representation, because I think it's really important. And I just think in general, all kinds of how people think, how people behave, all different kinds of experiences, it's important to see those in books. If you've read any of these, definitely let me know your thoughts. If you're interested in picking any of these up, I will have them linked in the description bar down below. But anyway, thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a lovely rest of your day, and I'll see you later. Bye.